Hello again, fifth graders. This is Mr. James. I'm back in my classroom today doing a recording for reading lesson 5. And today, my digital platform for showing my book isn't quite functioning. So we'll be doing all reading directly from the book. So hopefully you have your book with you so that you can follow along in your own text, because you won't get to see the words on the page like you have been seeing lately. But we'll adapt and overcome just like we're doing throughout this entire situation. So without further ado, today's enduring understanding is learners understand that explorers have had both positive and negative effects on societies. And our essential question, once again, is how do readers quote accurately from a text when comparing and contrasting themes and topics? We're going to be looking at the purpose and point of view. Our objective says I can determine purpose and point of view. And we'll be figuring out what the author's purpose is for writing this and what their point of view or perspective about this event is. So, without further ado, which I think I already said once, but that's all right, we're going to begin with this section here that talks about Antarctica. Please make sure you're following along in your own text as I read. The race to the pole. In 1911, no explorer had ever reached the South Pole. That year, the British explorer Robert Scott announced his plan to go there at the same time as Norway's Roald Amundsen. It quickly became a race. Preparing for the pole, Scott prepared carefully for his journey. His team would use ponies and motorized sleds to carry supplies to, quote, dumps along the route. And the explorers would travel between these, collecting supplies as they went. After the last supply dump, they would man-haul, which meant dragging their foods and equipment along on sleds. Scott's team set out for the South Pole from Cape Evans on November 1st, 1911. Disastrous end. Scott's expedition was a disaster. The motorized sleds broke down. The ponies could not cope with the cold and ice, and the man-hauling supplies were exhausted. Scott and 4 others reached the pole 5 weeks after their Norwegian rivals, but they were too weak to get home safely, and all 5 explorers died. So I guess the question is this triumph or trouble? I'm going to read what they say, but I have my own opinions. Triumph. Scott and his men made a heroic effort in terrible conditions. Even though their equipment did not work, they still managed to reach the pole. In fact, some of them almost made it back. Or trouble. Scott made a mistake. People already knew how to travel safely through icy waste using dog sleds, skis, and thick furs, which had been keeping explorers safe in the Arctic for many years. Amundsen used these and succeeded, and Scott failed because he did not. To me, all 5 explorers dying, it's probably more trouble than triumph. The next section is about Australia. The First Fleet. On January 26, 1788, a group of Eora people from Australia woke up to see 11 ships in the bay where they lived. This was unusual, as ships rarely passed through the bay. A welcome landfall. The people aboard the ships, which we now call the First Fleet, must have been very pleased to arrive. Their journey from Britain to Australia had taken 250 days, and they had endured storms, shortage of food and water, and even a mutiny. Were the British right to claim Australia? What do you think? When the British arrived in Australia, they decided that the land was legally terra nullius, Latin for no one's land. They thought this allowed them to claim the territory for Britain. Do you think that was right? The British settlement, the new arrivals quickly began to put up tents and then to build roads, fences, and houses. Their settlement would have looked strange to the Eora who lived, dressed, and used the lands differently than Europeans. The Europeans thought they could come into Eora country and settle there, but the land belonged to the Eora. Claiming Australia, the British knew before they arrived that people had already lived in Australia because another famous British explorer, Captain James Cook, had reached the coastline of eastern Australia in 1770 and made contact with these people who lived there. We now call these people Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, the British also knew that there was no government, army, or police force, so they decided to claim the land as their own. So even though there were people there, they just said, well, we're going to say this land belongs to us anyways. I don't know how fair that is. Conflict arises. As at first, the British and Eora people did not fight, but soon they were in conflict. The Eora people had lived on the land for centuries and respected the land, taking only what they needed and managing it well. The British fenced off large areas of the Eora people's land, which prevented them from crossing it. By 1790, many Eoras were frustrated by the new arrivals. A local leader named Pemulwuy began a series of attacks against the British and became a great hero to many Eora. The conflict lasted until Pemulwuy was killed in 1802. So was this triumph or trouble? Triumph. The arrival of the first fleet was the start of European settlement in Australia. Since then, Australia has become a wealthy, modern nation. Its people are from European, Asian, and other backgrounds, and they all share in the country's success or trouble. The arrival of the British was devastating for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. 2 years after the British arrived, up to 70% of the Eora had died of smallpox. In the next 100 years, the total number of Indigenous Australians dropped from roughly 1 million to 60,000. Today, Indigenous Australians make up about 3% of the population. For the most part, they have not shared in Australia's modern wealth, and they are among the country's poorest people. So it appears that a lot like in our own country, Australia had an issue with the people who came to their country, affecting the people who already live there or the indigenous people in very negative ways. So you get to make up your mind, though, whether it was more triumph or more troubling, or maybe a combination of both. Please make sure that you use text evidence to answer the questions that are in your packet, and I will talk to you again very soon. Have a great rest of your day, or until the next time.